Hello from Reichenau. I'm Arabella Fenyves. Good morning. You're watching a talk with music on historically informed performance practice with Clive Brown and Stefan Gottfried. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
I'll be hosting. I'll be hosting together with ISA Artistic Director Johannes Meissl. Good morning, Johannes.
My pleasure.
Johannes, isn't it exciting to have two such eminent figures of their field on your faculty and here with us today?
It definitely is, of course, and I'm very happy to have Clive Brown and Stefan Gottfried at this year's ISA, because the topic of ISA, looking at things that we think are already set and exist, always anew, is as important as coming up with totally new things, and I think this will be part of our talk and the practical examples we are going to show. I'm really grateful that you're here. It's, I think, on you to introduce both dear friends of mine, and I want to state maybe one thing that, of course, it's about knowledge, information, and a bit what you regard as the work of scholars, but Stefan Gottfried is an eminent practical musician, and Clive Brown is a really, really great violinist himself. So, and maybe you know that I'm still also quite much into practice, in the double sense. And so, so we will try to make a connection of maybe really exciting new findings from the scholarly side and the practical implications.
Yes, Johannes, all three of you are amazing practitioners. Let me just give you some background on Clive Brown. Clive Brown now lectures at the MDV after his official retirement from teaching in the UK, where he was a lecturer at Oxford University and then a professor at the University of Leeds. Clive has written countless books and articles, notably a monograph of violinist and composer Louis Spohr, and, of course, highly relevant to today's lecture, recital, and talk, Classical and Romantic Performance Practice, which is soon to go to its next revised edition. It will be coming out soon, so get your copy. Also, Clive, you've written a book about Mendelssohn, and you have, very importantly, published several critical edition scores of Brahms, Elgar, and Mendelssohn, to name a few, and the most recent edition that has been published is the Beethoven Violin Sonatas. I think you're very proud of those, aren't you? Quite. Stefan Gottfried is a professor at the Department of Early Music at the MDV at the moment. And of course, he had an international concert career as a soloist and continuo player in ensembles with historical instruments, as well as with modern orchestras. He then gradually became more and more involved with conducting. After his friend and mentor Nikolaus Harnoncourt resigned in 2015, Stefan Gottfried took over the co-direction of the Concentus Musicus Wien and is now its artistic director, I think in the 6th or 7th year already. He regularly performs with them, offering exciting views on Baroque masterpieces, operas, and also little-known repertoire. So we really have three people here who know a lot about this field, and I'm very excited to watch them work with some young talents, and also we're going to discuss amongst ourselves first, because it's been decades that we have historically informed performance practice. This word and this practice has been around since the 50s, let's say. Where do we stand today? And is this motto, this year's theme of the ISA, always anew, is that fitting for historically informed performance practice?
Clive,
Shall I respond to that straight away?
please.
Well, I suppose you could also call this rediscovering the old as well as the current title. And I think the point is really that we can learn such a lot from the past. Things are always anew because it's an inevitable thing for developments to happen in human life, and in musical performance it's exactly the same. No one generation really wants to play like the previous generation. They always want to contribute something else. And for that reason, performing practices change hugely over time. I always like to think of the early 20th century as being a period of great revolution. It certainly was. I mean, you have to look at all the arts and you see how they rejected the past. When they did that, there was a more serious rejection, I think, of what had gone on before that than there had ever been in the past. Maybe there was something a bit similar at the end of the 18th century, but it's not quite as clear. And when they did that, they abandoned a lot of the performing practices that people had used up to that time. We are still, in a sense, living with the consequence of that 20th century revolution, and it's also been affected hugely by recordings and recording studios, which put many constraints on performers. A lot of the practices that were used in the past, which were very much improvisatory, are very difficult to reproduce under those kinds of conditions. So there's just an enormous amount for us to rediscover. The period instrument movement, which, yes, started in the 20th century already with Arnold Dolmetsch much earlier, and there had been examples of in the 19th century. And that developed hugely in the 60s and 70s. I lived through that, of course, and it was a very exciting time. One was hearing different sounds from different kinds of instruments. Inevitably, people who started to do that had to use fundamentally the techniques that they already possessed. And that's a very interesting question. I don't want to go into it in depth, but it does affect the way that we play that music. And gradually over time, I think we've been discovering that some of the practices we currently use in modern performance are very different from those of the past and have huge consequences for what comes out when you play the instruments. So this is another really interesting area to experiment with. It's not about recreating the past. I think I would want to stress that very strongly. It's not something we can do. There's no way that we can recreate the past of the 19th and 18th centuries. We could, if you like, imitate early recordings, and sometimes that's a very instructive thing to try and do. But we don't want to recreate the things exactly as they were, because we are not those people, and you are not those people either. So you wouldn't receive the message in the same way. But what we can do is to learn that there were practices that people used which actually make a lot of sense. And if we try to reintroduce them into our modern performance, not with any feeling that we are recreating a past model, but simply using a technique that was felt to be valuable, then I think it's something we really should try to do.
So for you, it's like looking to the past for inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely really? That. And I think what's quite important for me, obviously, is that I want to know as much as possible about what they did do in the past. What were their aesthetics? How did they use these practices? And again, we just can learn from that. Mm-hmm. I think there are some things which never change, which is the fundamental feeling you have about music and making music. They don't change, but they do shift. And I think in modern times we have kind of lost some of the connection that people in the past had with the emotional content of the music. Because we have been rather obsessed, we became rather obsessed, especially after the appearance of urtext editions, which, again, really happened in my lifetime. We became really quite obsessed with, that's what the composer wrote, that's probably what we should be playing. Whereas the composers themselves considered their notation to be only a starting point for the performer. In the 18th century especially, when very little instruction for performance is written into it. And there was a concept at the beginning of the 20th century of richtiger Vortrag and schöner Vortrag, to use the German terms, correct performance and beautiful performance. And if you were a student, you learned richtiger Vortrag to the point of great technical excellence before you were permitted to do schöner Vortrag. And then schöner Vortrag was about doing all sorts of things that weren't written down in the score, but were considered to be beautiful, to make that emotional message of the music come across to the listener. And if you couldn't do that, you didn't really have a future as a musician. There's a wonderful comment that comes in an 1804 piano treatise by August Eberhard Müller, where he says that if you don't have it in you, you can become ein brauchbarer Orchesterspieler oder Chorsänger, was allerdings zu schätzen, aber nicht Kunst ist. Now that's roughly translated. You can become a decent orchestral player or singer, choral singer, but it's a good thing, but it's not art. Yeah? And that was a really strong idea at that time. So making music was about going beyond the score.
Thank you very much for that, really. Full accordance and full agreement. But I would like to bring something into our talk before we then get to some musical examples also. Isn't the situation that we are living in somehow very much characterized by the coexistence of so many different possibilities and aesthetics also? We still see very strong examples of what you described as the consequences of the revolution in the early first third of the 20th century. Then we have a lot of different appearances, historically informed or whatever, more or less radically or consequently integrating all these things into their performances. And then we have a wide field of especially the younger generation of musicians who quite naturally already grew up with a lot of information that comes from all these developments, starting with the period music and the historical instruments use and so forth, because they actually haven't experienced anything else anymore, because they worked with teachers who already were part of these developments and so forth. So for me, I find it very interesting not to separate into something, well, that's the section of the ones who just try to transform what they think is written into sound, and then there are the others. It's all over the place and in all sorts of combinations, and therefore I'm very curious and also, of course, grateful for every new element that is inspiring, helping in finding one's way as a young musician. I mean, we are still very, very interested and very, very enthusiastic, but it's actually not so much about us. It's very much about the young people, and it's very much about how can they somehow sort all this out and find the confidence and also the necessary security and being assured that what they are doing makes sense, so that they really can bring us forward also into the future with performance that is, and this is my point I keep repeating all the time, which is only worthwhile if it is something that happens now. Always. And not something that you can say, well, that's a fine package and this I can store in the shelf, and if it's necessary I take it from there and then I deliver it. This is not what we expect from musical performance in the future, and this, so
because for me, I think it's the most challenging factor of doing this research and do this work with performance practice. For me, what's most important? The performer is much more important than we now thought. So you use your fantasy, your improvisations, your fantasy, be inventive. I think that's the most important message of the old sources. So bring it as new. Your personality is important. Do it your way. I think, okay, there's much information how to do it, or possibilities how to do that. But I think for me that's the most challenging aspect of that. You as a performer, you're much more important than you thought, than you think. Yeah.
Stefan, what are some of your sources that you like to work with? What do you look for inspiration?
We have chosen two of the wonderful students of the ISA, Paula and Itamar. We worked the last days about a little bit Mozart and Beethoven, and we tried out some aspects. How would our playing, your listening, our understanding of this music would change? Yeah, when we try to get some information in our playing, and we would like.
Would you like to demonstrate that?
Yeah.
Fine. Well, let me introduce Paula then. Paula Jadrušić is in her third year as a piano student at the Zagreb Music Academy currently. She has won numerous prizes in competitions as a soloist as well as a chamber musician, and has performed as a soloist with the Zagreb Soloists and Dubrovnik Symphony Orchestra. She will work on Mozart's Stupor variations with Stefan today, I believe, focusing on the theme and variation number 1. Welcome, Paula.
Demonstrate, how is our playing and your listening experience changing if you put in some stuff of this so-called historical informed performance practice. So we would like to start very as a cliche, but how would it sound, would be usually to hear Mozart nowadays in a modern way of understanding Mozart. Very nice, neat, very exact, klassisch in his real sense. And I would ask you to play the thema, nice, modern Mozart. Thank you for that. So, we start, I think, with the most important aspect. The melody is a dance, is a minuet written by the French cellist Jean-Pierre Duport, who lived in Berlin in this time, and then Mozart met him, and he took a melody, a minuet theme from Duport, and made his first improvisations, and then he made a composition, these 9 variations in D major. So what would mean menuet? So we need a dance feeling. And if you just study menuet dancing, it's not so difficult to get this basic step. The most important thing, the menuet step goes over 2 bars. It's not this cliché, dang, da, da, dim. It's completely wrong. We have a not so easy basic step, 1, bi, da, dum, di, da, dum. So it goes over 2 bars. For us musicians, it's very important information. Phrase in 2 bars, so you have 2 possibilities. Go to the 2nd bar. Yeah, especially we can demonstrate it in a 2nd bar. For instance, 2 possibility, not ba 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 bam, but yam ba ba bam, or the opposite, yam ba ba bam, and suddenly it begins to dance. Paula, may I ask you to do the 2nd part and show both possibilities of this 2-bar phrasing? Thank you very much. Or the opposite, phrasing to the 2nd bar. Just a little detail. Wait for when you land on the 2nd bar. Wait a little bit. So it's very important for this dancing feeling. Not ba 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 ba. Yeah, ba ba ba. So this smooth landing on the 2nd. Ba ba. I think it's a little bit too fast and too fast your touch. Yeah, ba ba ba. Yeah. Smooth. Much better. Yeah. So we would try only with this knowledge. It's menuet, 2 bars, phrasing music. Yeah, and play with that. Also considering, also in this time, when you saying a thing at a second time, don't do it the same. Make it different. Make it different. Always anew is also a really challenge and really important. So Paula, please try to give this menuet feeling, these 2 bars going to that, and play with that also in the repetition with your dance-like phrasing. So different. Make it different. Piano. Change the dynamics too. And why not pianissimo? To only 2 informations, be creative, inventive with dynamics, and this menuet phrasing, and I think you could hear it really changes the music, and you're listening to a nice Mozart theme. Don't do it twice the same. Leads to another really important topic. I think you felt it. Da di da da. It occurs so often, and with the time, I think there's lacking something. There's an emptiness, da, bi, da, and we should feel it. And we know it was so, as we said before, the performer's role for being creative, inventive, putting some ornaments into the music was so important, and the performers would be expected to do that. So let's talk about. And let's try out some ornamentation. We worked on that. It's not so easy if you if you begin to ornament, what to do when you repeat it, and so and so. And Paula found, I think, a very nice solution. And when you do that, to repeat the parts becomes to make sense. Otherwise, why repeating the same way? So listen to Paula playing the theme, menuet-like, playing with dynamics, and put our ornaments. Take time. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, this is a reaction we should get. Yeah, when performers begin to be creative and use their fantasy to. So I think it's only a starting point, but yeah, it's not many ornaments, but they help really to keep it fresh, to be surprised, and to keep really listening. What's happening now? What will happen next? Thank you very much. Perhaps another aspect in the very first variations to show another aspect what would be really helpful to keep Mozart really alive and not too strict and nice and harmless. We try to abandon this cliché of Mozart. So I would ask you again now, how are we used to play and listen this first variation? And so on, and so on. Very nice, rhythmically, rigid, strict playing. Mozart has to be in time, so no romantic things with rubato. But think of the situation, Mozart takes a melody, and he was famous for that, like Beethoven and Bach and Chopin and Liszt, and improvise spontaneously about it. And just think of Mozart is improvising, and he starts doodle, 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 like a machine. I think this can't be true. And two aspects help to, I think, to improve that and look between the lines, as Clive Brown invented these wonderful expressions. We have to learn to read between the lines of the score, of the music. So one aspect would help. Then in this time, they told you important notes. You have to stress what are important notes. A list of dissonances and very high, very low syncopations. Important notes. What to do with them? Play them with an accent. But in which understanding? There is a dynamic accent. But as one piano teacher of the generation of Mozart points it out, that you play important notes a little bit longer. I don't have to explain. Everyone knows that. No one knows that today. We wouldn't dare to play it. But we tried it. Important notes, dissonances. And we tried it, paralyzed it. Yeah, can you do a little bit too much of that? So together, yeah, can you a little more? Here. Yeah, and Paul is always doing what we then plan to demonstrate. If you do that, and only that, it would become a little bit. It would really lose energy and lose the flow if you just wait on important notes and do not any kind of compensation. So if you play, it gets a little bit boring and lose the flow. So as Paul already did, there is this secret concept of rubato, tempo rubato. You steal time, you rob time, but you're a nice thief, you give it back after a moment. So we tried it, we take time, and then we give it back time. And then I hope you will get the impression, we get it, it's very, very free, but still in balance. Paula, please try that. And we give it back. And also with a change dynamic. Yeah, and now rush away. Time. Yeah, we want to hear you. Yeah, please play it for us. Yeah, I think that's too much. So, da 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 diddle 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 da 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 diddle. Only the first time, but the second time, rush away, speed it up. Young. Pianissimo. Entrecitando, make an end. Subito piano. Much time. Pianissimo and veloce. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. So if you want to, yeah, if you want to experience that, just call Paula. She's able to do that. Or listen to recordings, for instance, Moritz Rosenthal, a Liszt pupil and a pupil of a famous Chopin pupil, Moritz Rosenthal, friend of Brahms and Johann Strauss. The younger Frédéric Chopin, waltz in C sharp minor. And so, yeah, just listen to that, you will hear that some passages he begin to dream, but afterwards he speed up. Otherwise, it would really lose everything if you stay always in your dreams. Sometimes it's time to awake.
Yeah. Stefan, yeah, that was really
you,
fascinating. Stefan, that was super interesting to watch you work with Paula, and there's just so many questions now, because obviously you were trying out a certain aesthetic, trying out different ideas, and I'm just wondering if you could share with us maybe some of the sources, because I'm wondering whether this kind of playing with the length of notes and emphasis and so on, I'm sure that's in your system and you've internalized it now. But maybe you can scroll back to some of those sources you originally went
Especially for this lengthening important notes, which is really a revolution for us. Comes from, for instance, from Daniel Gottlob Türk, the generation of Mozart. He composed he wasn't the avant-garde composer. He composed so many nice pre-classical sonatas. But what he's saying about performing music is really strange. And I speak about it. He said, as I told, I don't have to explain it. It's completely clear. And he also gives a maximum. How long was it a maximum? And he said, yeah, just the maximum is to dot. We tried that out, just to dot the rhythm. So dot it, that's the maximum.
Yeah.
And he's a piano teacher of, it's not Chopin, Liszt or Brahms, it's the Mozart generation, Mozart Clementi.
Yeah, and of course Mozart's father. I mean, we're talking about violin playing, but he says that whenever you have a slur, of two notes, you must make the first one longer and the second one shorter, but arrive at the next beat at the right time. And if you have more notes under a slur, you must also do the same thing at all times, he says. So it's, yes, very clear.
And he says it changed everything, and it really changes everything to do that.
There came a very important question regarding these things, of course, and therefore the question put by Arabella. Where do we get this? How can we know? Of course, a book like Clive Brown's Classical and Romantic Performance Practice. No, it's not an an ad for the book. I just mean, the thing is, there is, of course, an abundance of sources, actually, and what is necessary to find a way what to rely on, what to use, how to read the sources, and not to, again, try to be kind of just literally, or to be very eclectic and mixing aesthetics from different regions of the time and so forth. So it is this, and the other question was, and how do you learn, how do you find out what is appropriate in terms of ornamentation and embellishment? And of course, as I just whispered to Arabella here, there are lots of suggestions and rules, and of course it's combined with information, with necessary information. But it would be really nice to get a bit of this from the two of you, because I mean it's the same thing if you become a really excellent jazz musician. Of course, you have to learn all the standards, and you have to learn the possible patterns and so forth, and then you can learn to behave really freely. Yeah. And I think it's very similar.
It's very similar
for us.
At the time I wrote that book, which was in the 1990s, we still were not really familiar with many early recordings. That's happened in the last 25, 30 years. And since then, I've now found fascinating additional evidence about this business of bending notes, which is that people were still doing it at the beginning of the 20th century. So, for instance, you listen to the recordings of Karl Reinecke, who was born in 1824 in Beethoven's lifetime, and he's doing that all the time. And in string playing, you hear it with the Klingler String Quartet, a younger ensemble, but protégés of Joseph Joachim, who goes way back into the same sort of period as Reinecke. And if you listen to their Mozart recordings, they do it particularly strongly in Mozart, in both cases, really fascinating. And then I found another fascinating piece of evidence too, which was that Karl Klingler of the Klingler Quartet, who do this, wrote in his old age, he lived to be 95, wrote in his old age in the middle of the 20th century. This was just what everybody did from the 18th century through to our time, and now it's been forgotten. Yeah, so this is the disappearance of a tradition.
So you do research in recordings as well as books? Both of you, actually.
The recordings can make a lot of... they can either confirm or make you think hard about other things.
And the good news is that these recordings get more and more accessible now, quite easily. It's different from decades earlier, where you had to have some very special connections to find an old
just
copy.
YouTube, a composer plays his own compositions.
You can just go to your internet and listen to those things if you want to follow it up.
But Clive, do you have some suggestions where one could look for such old recordings? I mean, the performance you just mentioned, you Google them, or is there a particular library?
No, you simply Google them, and you'll find the Klingler Quartet recordings are not so easily available on the internet, but they're on CD. But if you Google, you'll find all that information.
Do you mention some of these artists in your book?
Oh yes, of course. I've drawn on them much more in the revised edition now.
Right. Okay.
And you have to build up traditional lines, so Klingler, Joachim, Brahms, to get some really traditions. Not every artist is really so interesting. The same with the piano traditions, so for instance, Moritz Rosenthal, as a Liszt pupil, is very interesting, more interesting than perhaps Paderewski.
Those of you who are interested in following it up might want to listen to a wonderful recording by Marie Soldat, who actually taught at MDV back in the early part of the 20th century, who was Brahms's favorite violinist for his sonatas, along with Joachim. And they often played together, and she made some recordings around 1920, which are quite astonishing. The quality of her playing, the subtlety, the flexibility, the use of vibrato, portamento, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is amazing.
Should we
just another example of the piano?
Yes, Beethoven.
With Itamar?
Yes. So we have some Beethoven prepared for you by Itamar Esformes. He currently studies with Emanuel Krasowski at the Buchmann Mehta School of Music in Tel Aviv. He is the recipient of several scholarships, performed live on radio and extensively in his community for many years. Today he will be working on Beethoven's Sonata Opus 22 number 11 with Stefan, focusing on the beginning of the second movement, I believe. Sure. Welcome,
Please
Itamar.
So now we want to focus only on two aspects: tempo in general, and this phenomenon of the mystery of the tempo rubato of the 18th century and also of the 19th century. So second movement, the slow movement of this sonata, And please, I want to ask you, Itamar, to play it, as we could hear it nowadays, in most cases, with the rain. And so on, and so on. And Itamar, in our lesson, he said, but I would prefer to play it a little bit more flowing. And then very often, it was also my experience, the teachers, who are mostly older than the student, they often say, no, don't rush it. You have to really to learn to enjoy the slowness and this feeling of zoom every note. And you're too young to really can feel that. But the interesting point is we looked up, we have many informations, also hundreds of metronome marks for Beethoven, by himself, and by one of his most famous people, I think you know him, Carl Czerny, who published metronome marks and many remarks to the piano solo and chamber music, and also for the piano concertos. And we looked it up. It was the same metronome mark as Itamar wanted to play. It's about 100 for eighth notes. So now we hear it in Itamar's and Carl Czerny's tempo, and perhaps in Beethoven's tempo. Thank you, and so on. And now, tempo rubato. What did it mean in the 18th century? We will scream it out, what tempo rubato is, and play it out. There's this famous letter by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, but only to know, it's a well-documented phenomenon, especially in the 18th century, coming from the Italian bel canto singing tradition. So it's not only Mozart's freakiness, it's really a phenomenon of the whole music making during the 18th and also the 19th century. He's traveling through Germany and writes every day letters to Salzburg, to his family, and he's complaining. Well, perhaps we try that. He tells that here, I think it's in Augsburg, the city of his birth, city of his father, they play rubato in slow movements. Okay, that's new for us. We expect to play this as Itamar did, really very rigid in tempo, but he experienced and he gives the information. They use a lot of rubato in adagio movements. Can we try that out in our modern understanding? So use agogics. Perhaps speed up a little bit. Take time. And so on, and so on. So, yeah. Okay. That's very unexpected for classical slow movements. But Mozart is complaining about that. He wants both things. He wants the strict pulsating tempo and the freedom the rubato playing of the melody. So how does it work? So we need a free tempo, flexible melody, but we still want to have this strict heart beating thing. And that's the point. He points it out, and his father is explaining that, and all the vocal teachers and the other piano teachers and flute and string treatises speak about that. So the left hand, so the accompaniment stays in tempo, and the right hand, the melody, you can really play rubato, and this is completely strange for our listening experience in classical music. I think we know it from other music traditions, from jazz, pop, chanson, folk music, but not in classical music. And now we try that out to be really that freaky, also with Beethoven, also in classical music. The right hand is free. If she feels more excited, she accelerates a little bit, and then she begins to dream again and slow down. But the left hand, as Mozart points out, doesn't know anything about that. I hope you can hear it. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Just a starting point, completely new feeling, experience, coordination of left and right. It's a starting point, but let's start.
Stefan, before we go on to Mendelssohn, I just wanted to ask you, because it seems to me that music making is all about making choices. And you're talking a lot about making these choices. And how do you develop the confidence in how to make these choices? And how do you decide what comes first, what's more important? Like when you're looking at all these different sources, as we were saying before, that there's so much information out there. Like, where do you start? Or is it just something that you have to develop over time?
I think it's a good way, this idea of richtiger und schöner Vortrag. Start really to control your hands and playing together and playing with the pulse. Be able of that.
Yeah.
And it's really the basics. Don't start with these things, otherwise totally chaos. And then if you're really able of that, so yeah, try out to take your liberties, free yourself.
So one could say maybe just also to really put it very clearly as no. Is it back there? Now you can hear it. Yes. I think it's because of the reverberation within the hall and for the streaming. That's a bit problematic with this thunderstorm going on outside. It is necessary to be able to control also an equal distribution of equal notes in order to be able to then start to deliberately not be equal and not be in synchrony. Clive, would you agree? Also for the chamber music?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll come to the business of asynchrony in a moment, but there's a really interesting concept that was developed by the flautist, Fürstenau. When he's writing about these things, he talks about richtiger Vortrag and schöner Vortrag, and then he talks about richtiger Vortrag, höhere Sinn. So a correct performance of a higher kind, which means that you actually are aware of the messages in the notation which are not clear. So in other words, when there are a pair of slurred notes, you play the first one a bit longer. You don't play them as a pair of slurred notes of exactly the same length. That's not even really richtiger Vortrag. Richtiger Vortrag, höhere Sinn, means that you know these little things and you know what dots under a slur mean in terms of how you perform that in different contexts. So many of those things. And yeah, they did not expect in the way that we do today, and again, I rather think the recording studios have got a lot to do with this, because you do hear it on early recordings before they became spliced and connected to get the very best performance of everything, of being together. Being together was not an important thing for them. And again, I can quote Karl Klingler. In a conversation he had during the 1930s, which is reported in a book by the person he talked to, they discussed the question of playing together. And the person he was talking to said she really didn't like the way that everybody had to play exactly together all the time. And he said, no, neither do I, but if I wrote anything about that, it would be misunderstood, he says. Because in that context, you could hardly suggest not playing together. That also brings me to the question of when you play chords on the piano. Do you always play the chords together? We do now. Ever since Schnabel, who rejected the whole idea of spreading chords, we play them together. But Carl Czerny, having told us first of all that the first way that you have to play a chord is together, then says, but there are very many exceptions. And then he spends many pages telling you exactly where the exceptions come. And the conclusion is then that actually very few chords are really played completely together. And if one reads a treatise by the important pianist Kramer, written, of course, Kramer's studies were used by Beethoven in his teaching, and he says there are two ways of playing chords. You can play them exactly together, which is mostly done at the end of a piece or at the end of a section, or you can play them in a slanting direction. And it's quite clear again from that the main way you play them is not together. But of course, that if you tell that to a modern player, and they start to try and do it, they will make it sound absolutely horrible, because they have no idea of the subtleties that are required to do that beautifully. It isn't always a matter of just spreading from the bottom of the chord to the top. Sometimes you start somewhere in the middle and play them very tightly together, but not completely together. Hummel in his treatise says that the normal way to play chords on the Viennese forte piano is not quite together. And he says this gives a much better effect and produces better fortes than playing them exactly together. So that kind of asynchrony between two hands on the piano, I mean, there's the other asynchrony, which is that the right hand comes a little bit after the left, or very occasionally a little bit before the left, is another expressive resource. And again, it's imitating melody against accompaniment, which would be done by singers, violinists, flautists, and so on. The accompaniment would stay steady. This is again tempo rubato. The accompaniment stays steady, but the soloist bends the melody in the way that they want, and they have to be together at the most important places, but in between, they can not be together.
May I ask a question in this context with rubato and flexibility, because there, especially regarding this, the famous Mozart example Stefan mentioned, and then when the more general and wave-like understanding of rubato started in the 19th century, because I mean we can still tell also from recordings, of course, that this was very much the case, and there are extreme examples like this recording by Rachmaninoff of the second Chopin ballade, where he speeds up actually to double tempo and returning, and it sounds perfectly balanced and perfectly organic. So when did this happen, and where do you think, Clive, maybe are there any limits, or is it in the first place always to really give it a try, and then find out what apparently not is working, something like that? Because normally people are much too hesitant. This is my experience.
I mean, there are limits, of course, because it can be tasteless as well. But the two things have coexisted probably through the whole history of performance in the Western world. Carl Friedrich Emanuel Bach is absolutely clear about this, and he gives an example. He says, if you are playing with a group of really fine musicians, then you can make real changes to the tempo. You can get faster, you can get slower, and the others, because they're fine musicians, will follow you and do it together. But he says, if you're playing with a group of players who are not really so good, you can't do that. They have to play in time, and you can bend the melody. So that was in the 1750s. And it goes right through. And if you read all the reviews, now it's actually, again, those of you who are interested, with modern internet resources, it's very, very easy to read anything from the past. There's a wonderful Austrian site, the Anew site. You can word search it and find all sorts of fascinating things. You read the reviews and you'll find there's constant complaint about people doing it badly. So, you can do it beautifully, you can do it not so beautifully. The only thing that would not be considered at all musical is not to do it at all. And Carl Philipp Emanuel is perfectly clear about that. Anyone who doesn't do it has got a bad performance style, he says.
Clive, I find it fascinating to listen to you, and I just want to pick up on one thing before we move on to Mendelssohn, because you spoke, Johannes, about hesitancy, that people are hesitant to try something out. And I think that comes from fear of being told off, actually. I think especially with students, I mean, there are, as we mentioned before, different opinions. And I'm sure there are teachers who say, no, that's wrong, you should play a quarter note or whatever here, or you're not on the right beat or something like that. So how to handle this? I mean, I think listening to you, it's so interesting, because I think it's inspiring to look at these different sources and look at the options. So what would you say? To investigate these options is maybe the most important thing, and then it's a matter of when can you show them, or when do you have the freedom to go with them, or which situation?
I have to go back to this idea of richtige and schön.
Yeah.
Until you can do it correctly, in other words, do all the notes on the page, keep in a steady tempo, then there's no point in trying to do the other things. Otherwise, it will be undisciplined and probably unmusical.
Yes.
Yeah, in most cases. Some people may have such an innate feeling for it, they can do it straight away, but most of us have to learn how to do it beautifully. And we have to learn by listening to great performers. Now, there's a problem for us, because we don't have any great performers who are doing this yet, really, to any big extent. And in those days, they had lots of them. We can hear it on some of the early recordings. That at least can be a kind of model to inspire us. But we shouldn't necessarily believe that what we hear from Karl Reinecker or from Karl Klingler or Josef Joachim is really how they played it 50 years before that. They certainly didn't. On the other hand, it can give us insights into those practices.
Well, that's a good point. Richtige und schöne Vortrag. I think that's something to remember from today. Well, let's...
And schöne Vortrag, hören
Sinn.
Yeah. Because that is also incredibly important. I shouldn't minimize the importance of actually understanding what the composer wanted the notation to convey to the performer. It might have been a quite wide range of things, but there are many notations which we don't understand today. I mean, let me give you one example, because we'll come across it in the Mendelssohn. When you see a slur with dots under it, we know that's portato. We call it portato, or sometimes people call it portamento. And we assume that it means you play it longer than if the notes had only got dots. But sources from right at the beginning of the 19th century, Louis Adam, for instance, in 1804, going right through Ignaz Moscheles, associate of all the great Viennese performers of the early 19th century, explain that when you see that, it actually means to play the chords in a slightly arpeggio manner. And we don't, I mean, you play a Brahms sonata, the E minor cello sonata, or the G major violin sonata, which starts off with chords marked with this. Everybody plays the chords together. Brahms absolutely did not expect that. It's just as much an indication as that sign to make.
Well, let's go straight into the practical part of demonstrating that then. The trio Rigamonti is going to play for you now, and it's formed by 3 siblings. Miriam plays the piano, Mariella the violin, and Emanuele the violoncello. They have been performing extensively for more than 8 years throughout Italy and internationally, and have already played at Vienna's Musikverein. They will be working with Clive Brown on Mendelssohn's Piano Trio No. 1 in D minor, Opus 49. Yeah. Welcome, Trio Rigamonti.
we met once. We've had just one session together already, and I really enjoyed their playing right from the beginning. They play with great vigor and commitment, and so I think what I'd like to do is to ask them to play you the whole of the first movement of this trio. It's really worth listening to, I can assure you. And then we'll talk about some of the alternative possibilities. They might already be doing some of the things we talked about in the last session, but I don't think you should try particularly to do it. Just play it the way you feel it. Yeah? Good. Well, that was a marvelous performance. Thank you. I'm not even going to begin to try and claim that I'll make them play it better, because they play it really well, but I might make them try and play it a bit differently in some respects. And maybe some of the things that we try might be things that you find interesting and want to do more with. Let's take it point by point. Let's have a look at one or two things, first of all. Can you just play this passage from here with that played in the modern way, yeah? Just play it exactly in the modern way. Okay, good. And well, you can't see the notation there, but it's got this thing with the lines, the slurs and the dots under it. So now you play it where you have the passage with the dots and the slurs, play those in the slightly spread manner. Makes a small difference, but it's an important difference, because the piano ceases to be a percussion instrument and becomes a singing instrument. There's a wonderful treatise written in the 1850s. Well, it's not really a treatise, but it has a treatise kind of section at the beginning. And it's called L'Art du Chant appliqué au piano by the great pianist Sigismund Thalberg, who was Liszt's only rival in that time, which, of course, translated means the art of singing applied to the piano. And he explains painstakingly in this introduction that you often have to go against the actual nature of the piano in order to make it sing. And the nature of the piano is essentially to be a percussion instrument, and you can do all sorts of clever things with it. It's much harder to play this Mendelssohn on a modern piano than it would have been on Mendelssohn's piano. I mean, he likes this incredibly fast, light music, which, with the lighter action, is much easier to do. And sometimes we have to take slightly different tempos with modern instruments than we would. Then the other issue that we have to think about is the fact that with modern instruments, we've got a totally different balance than Mendelssohn would have had with his instruments. The strings are decidedly not as powerful as the piano. It was the other way round in Mendelssohn's time. The strings were more powerful than the piano. So this poses big problems for the performers. Let's take this step by step. That's one place where Mendelssohn has indicated that he wants you to do little arpeggiations. There's one point in the movement where he's actually marked these curvy lines. And if you see that and you think, well, then he obviously, you might even be able to just see it there. There's the arpeggiation markings there in the score. It's actually preceded by the other marking of dots under a slur. So the implications there might be that he wants you to do slight arpeggiation followed by bigger arpeggiation. Let's try that. You know what I mean? That's from here. Yeah? Just the piano.
And they play
from there. Yeah, just play it in the way that I want you to play it now. Yeah? With arpeggiation. So you have to arpeggiate those a little bit. You have to prum. Yeah? Yeah, not the modern way. Yeah, now only some of those were marked with arpeggio by Mendelssohn, and you might legitimately say, well, surely he knew what he wanted, he put arpeggiation marks, he didn't want you to do it anywhere else. You might say the same thing about Karl Reinecker. And I should just explain that Karl Reinecker, along with Joseph Joachim, were both given their first opportunity to give a big public performance by Mendelssohn himself at the Gewandhaus in 1843, and both of them lived long enough to make recordings. Anyway, Karl Reinecker, in his own compositions, sometimes marks this. And we are lucky enough to have his own recordings of those compositions. And it's astonishing because, well, there's one in which he marks it 3 times with the arpeggiation. He plays about 50 arpeggiations in the piece. And when he writes espressivo at one point, he makes particularly lush and long arpeggiations. So there were all sorts of other guidance things that were happening. We can only make the conclusion that he absolutely had to have those particular chords arpeggiated. For the rest, it was up to the performer to use their imagination and to make the music speak. Now, let's go to the strings for a minute for one or two issues. I supplied them with a very interesting 19th century edition of the trio, which has lots of fingering and bowing in the string parts. And you would probably agree that it was a bit astonishing for you. You would never choose anything like that if you were playing that music. So what is the point of those bowings and fingerings? Well, the bowings are to do with whereabouts in the bow you played the notes, to a large extent. We have got into the habit, which we do a lot of the time, of playing lots of things in the lower part of the bow. Up to the beginning of the 20th century, that was a rather rare thing to do. And then it starts to be taught as the right way to do it by Carl Flesch, among others, a very important source of teaching material. In the 19th century, they didn't do it, and in the 18th century, they certainly didn't do it, except maybe as special effects, because they had a very different way of using their bow arm. They moved not from the shoulder, as we do quite often today. In fact, that was considered to be the worst thing you could possibly do, and you were told either to stand up against a wall or some other means of stopping you moving the upper arm, or in the case of campagnoli, you have a string tying your upper arm to your body. Everything was done from the wrist and the elbow. And so that changes the whole way you use the bow. It's the same with the cello. As little movement of the upper arm as possible. And this means it almost drives you to play more in the middle of the bow, because as soon as you're in the lower half of the bow, you have to start moving your shoulder. So you'd have to do that when you play long notes, but when you play faster notes, you're in the middle of the bow or further up the bow. And that changes a lot of things. So what are we going to do to demonstrate some of that? Could you play the first bit just without the piano, because otherwise we shall be rather obscured, with the fingerings from this copy? Great. Okay, that's fine. That's enough there. Now, the very beginning, when you play it on the cello, you have to shift position between the first and second notes, don't you? Yeah. So this is a probable place where we would have a hint of a portamento. The finger that plays the lower note would slide into the new position, and then the next note would come down. It was often done between bow strokes. Ta ya. But you have to do it, you judge it that the slide happens in the up bow and then the next note comes in the down bow. Try. But I need to hear more of the porta. Now you're sliding up with the second finger. Yeah? Slide entirely all the way to the new position with the first. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Now that's explaining something about the kinds of portamentos they did. Of course, you can go to the treatises, you can find lots of information about how they did portamento, but it's an art. It's like the arpeggiation on the piano. It's an expressive art which you can use in all sorts of ways. But if you do it wrong, it sounds disgusting. Spohr actually says if you do the wrong kind where you slide with the finger that's taking the higher note, it sounds like a wailing. Heulen, I think is the German term he uses, and it's absolutely not to be done. And Carl Flesch, actually, when he's now recommending in the 20th century that we do that sort of slide, he says, oh, this would have been considered a deadly sin in my youth. I would have been thrown out of the conservatoire if I'd been heard doing that. So you can see how tastes also change. And I'm not saying that one taste is better than another taste, but it's very useful to us to enter into the taste of the past to understand these things. The other thing you might have noticed about what they demonstrated was that they didn't use nearly so much vibrato as they used before. Why didn't they do that? Because it's obvious from the music you weren't expected to. It was obvious because it's full of harmonics, which you can't vibrate on, and open strings. which again, well, both of them you could produce it if you really tried, but it's not what you would do. So that's the other thing. The kind of sound that they were aiming for was a much different sound. You might find it difficult to conceive that you give up vibrato because it's an essential part of producing a beautiful sound in the 20th century view, but in my lifetime I've seen it change a great deal. There were people in my youth, and I myself used a lot of vibrato all the time. It's got less and less because I think it's the influence of the early music movement. There's much more variety now. Some people do more, some people do less, but you notice probably here that we're not hearing as much vibrato in the original performance as we would in many other performances. So that's one thing. Can we find a passage which demonstrates the portamentos better? Well, yeah, that's one there. Let's see. Wherever you have shifts in... That's right. So that's one of the passages. And what you heard there was a shift also to an open string, which was also done with portamento. That's described in the sources as well. Let's try the opening now and apply all of those principles to the first section. Then we'll talk about tempo afterwards. Okay. But now let's try and apply it by not using the vibrato so much. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use vibrato, but you should save it up for the places where it's really important, and then it makes an effect. Okay, I'll stop you one more time. I'll just stop you one more time, because here we have to focus much more on the bow. The bow needs to play more into the string to create the tone quality. Okay, there's one opportunity here for a more prominent portamento. Dee-da-dee-da. Do it more slowly. Just play that just on your own, that passage. Okay, once again, now, what is the effect if you do a portamento there? It's an emotional effect. It has a certain passionate quality to it. Bring that out a bit more this time. Yeah, you need to do it more for us to hear it. Do it more. Okay. And the whole point about that is that it's imitating the singer. The singer always connects notes in a way which other instruments don't naturally do. And the string instruments were seen as being the most powerful, the best instruments, because they could imitate the singer best. Now, let's look at the whole question of tempo. Mendelssohn, you might not think Mendelssohn requires an awful lot of tempo change, and in fact he sometimes has the reputation of liking good strict tempo. In fact, that's in the Grove Dictionary, the first edition. But Joachim, who was his protégé as a teenager, remarks in his notes on the violin concerto that nobody understood the elastic management of time better than Mendelssohn. So clearly Mendelssohn didn't play very strictly when he played his own music and didn't expect it from other people. Well, we do plenty of slowing down in this music. It's quite a common thing still in modern practice. But we don't do much speeding up, and the speeding up is also very important. It's not something you do as frequently as slowing down, but it is very important. And the tempo, as Calceni said, is never stable. He's very insistent that you don't depart noticeably from the main tempo, but he says that almost every line has a somewhat different tempo in the music. And it's about this fluctuation of emotion. When the music gets more intense, it moves forward. When it relaxes, it goes slower. So let's just try from the beginning again. And where are we going to? No, we won't go from the beginning. I think it's not the best place to do it. Let's start from the second subject area. Where's that? Yeah. 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 So we talked when we worked together about doing this, and can you try to apply what we talked about last time? Yeah? Going from ba. Okay, now I think we could do more with that. We could do a bit more. Where you have a crescendo like this, one of these what we call hairpins in English, it's often an indication to get faster. We can say that this certainly applies to Mendelssohn because there's a piano piece by Fanny Mendelssohn, written in 1826. The manuscript's in the Berlin Library. In which she fills it with these things, and at the bottom of the page she writes a little note and says, this means to get faster, and this means to get slower. She was actually using them exactly in that way. So I think when we play a Mendelssohn piece, we should really follow that. We know that Brahms also did that, so it was a tradition in the 19th century. Let's try that again with much more fluctuation, going forward, coming back. Try to feel it for yourselves. Now, move. Let's stop there, because here's a bowing issue. T probably is not what Mendelssohn and his colleagues would have done. Ferdinand David would almost certainly have played that in the middle and upper half of the bow with a broad détaché. Yeah? So let's just try before there and try it with a broad détaché, and let's see what the difference is.
From my team.
What's that? Yeah, from there, yes. Good. Okay, yeah, but one more time, much more vigorously. Into the string, yum, bum, bum, bee, yeah? Really good, forceful playing. Good. Right. So, I mean, you can hold in your mind what they did before and that. The second one is much more vocal. And again, I come back to this point that for pianists and for string players, imitating the finest singing was something that they really intended to do. When you used effects which were not vocal, these were special effects, and they were saved up for certain occasions and often simply for virtuoso music. But in this kind of serious chamber music, they would be used with great discretion. Mendelssohn certainly did use springing bow strokes, and he expected springing bow strokes in some places, but for the most part, they wouldn't have been used in this kind of repertoire. In the scherzo, yes, but not in this movement. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Yes, then we should stop.
Fascinating.
We could go on forever. Might I just come to 2 points, because, for example, this the dots or the strokes above the notes have, especially for string players, this very clear connection established that this has to be played with something like spiccato.
Or with a very short note.
So that's one point, and it is an example for being somehow totally conditioned in a certain way, and it's necessary to read all these things in a more differentiated way. And what I find extremely important, and I just realized what you said about the question of the non-synchronous chord playing in the piano. What my experience is all the time that young musicians who want to be really true and authentic in everything, and very true and very responsible, they take the absence of an indication as equally serious as the presence of one. And I think this is totally against the logics of writing music on paper. And I would like just to hear something about this from you. Well, maybe not for an hour, but
no, just very quickly. The staccato mark is a big issue, because as Johannes said, we have a kind of almost Pavlovian reaction to a staccato mark. Make it short. It definitely does not mean that. In 18th century music, it is often used only to say don't slur, because composers were very casual about these things. If they wrote nothing on the notes, they probably expected you to slur it. Beethoven, for instance, in the Opus 95 string quartet, he writes at one point where you have separate 16th notes after a whole lot of slurred ones, non-legato, because he doesn't want you to go on slurring them. And in his later works, he starts to use that rather than staccato. And maybe he's making a definite distinction there between what we would call a détaché and maybe a martelé or some other very short bow stroke. But yes, staccato marks can mean anything from play it absolutely smoothly to play it very short. Spohr's Violinschuh is the best example, and I'll just give you that, and then I'll be quiet. He gives you all the exercises in bowing. He marks, first of all, staccato strokes over the notes, and he says these must be played with as long a bow stroke as possible from the middle to the point, with no break at all between the notes. Then he gives exactly the same notation and says this is the martelé bow stroke. You play it at the point with short separated bow strokes. So for him, that notation does not give you a particular message. It is the only message it gives you is don't slur.
But what about Johannes' question about when there's no extra special marking? I mean, I think what you were saying, Johannes, that it's like some students take that as an absolute freedom to...
No? Sorry, it would be a misunderstanding. No, my experience is that if you have notes with a staccato, either dot or stroke, and then there come notes, but it's more or less the same musical place, that don't have any indications above them, then people immediately start to totally change the articulation. And then say, but there's no dot on it. And this is my point, that also reading what is given by the composers in addition to the pitch and the duration in the musical notation has a different logic behind than what we would assume from just taking everything literally.
And it changes over time.
It changes over time, of course.
If you compare a Haydn string quartet with something from the end of the 19th century, you see Haydn hardly any markings, the other ones, nearly everything is marked, because they started not to trust the performer. The role of the performer in relation to the composer changes hugely from the 18th to the end of the 19th century.
This is also the reason why there are many more dynamic indications and all sorts of things in the music.
But what I found was fascinating was that when you were working with the trio, that all the comments you made it sound even more organic afterwards. Actually, I mean, it was a super emotional performance to begin with, but it seemed extremely flowing and supernatural, so very musical. Everything that you brought out seemed very musical, don't you think?
Definitely so, and I think that would be a wonderful moment now to conclude this, to show that knowing these things and trying them out is not leading away from wonderful music making, but it is actually supporting and leading towards this.
Broadening the horizons.
And,
Yes.
and I would think that with that we find
Yes.
an ending. Because
Thank
I
you,
have to rush off.
Johannes. Thank you, Clive Brown. Thank you, Stefan, Gottfried, Paula, the trio Rigamonti, and Itamar. Thanks so much for your performances. Thank you so much for sharing your wide knowledge. And I'm going to go home and read, I think, and listen and get scores out. So I hope you were all inspired by today's music and talk. And thanks so much from Reichenau. Bye.
Thank you, Arabella.
The Russian